Hello, I'm Dr. Sherry, author of the Cruise Through History series of stories and the storybooks, also an onboard storyteller as the cruise ships sail the world to beautiful ports of call. Today, I would like you to join me as we sail into the harbor of Havana. As Bette Midler famously said, "Oh, Havana, so close to Miami, and yet so far, far away." If you're fortunate enough to be on a cruise ship sailing into the Havana harbor, you want to be on deck first thing in the morning as the cruise ship approaches the harbor. And you'll look off to your left and to your right, and you'll see the forts at the entrance to the harbor. You'll look up to the port side and you'll see the harbor blessing. And as you look up to the right and you see the skyline of Havana, and you'll see the Bacardi building in its little fanciful cupola, and beyond that, the dome of the Capitol building. So to tell the stories of Havana, I turn to Cruise Through History Itinerary 6. And this is the itinerary that takes us up the Atlantic coast of North America. And I've included all of the stories to do with Cuba and Havana in this itinerary because of the close relationship for so long between Cuba and the United States. A happy relationship, unlike the recent history. And we can only hope that as history repeats itself, we'll come into another lovely period of relationships. So, to begin our story, we want to note that Columbus sailed right by the harbor and he missed it in 1492, and he left it to 1511 when Velasquez came by, and he went across looking for the perfect harbor until he found it, and he named it San Cristobal in honor of the earlier explorer, and this harbor became the harbor of Havana. And as we come into Havana Harbor, we see the forts. And on our right, we'll see one of the forts guarding the east side of the harbor. This fort, built by the Spanish, is Castillo San Salvador. And as we look off the port side, we see yet another fort. This is known as El Morro. In 1806, Jefferson wanted to annex Cuba. And later presidents Polk and Pierce offered $100 million, and Pierce upped it to $130 million to try and buy Cuba from Spain. Such was its closeness to the United States and its affinity one for the other for a long period of time in its history. Well, unfortunately, one aspect of life that the United States and Cuba had in common was slavery. And as we come up closer to the port, we see this long row of whitewashed, almost two-story looking buildings, huge, extremely long row. This was the storage houses for the sugar cane that was produced by the slaves and the tobacco by the Taino Indians, because we must remember that the Indians were also enslaved until the fatalities among the Indians was just too much, and they produced the tobacco from which the Cuban cigar industry was born. So all of this was brought up to the ports. And as we come in, we come to one of the first forts built in 1562. And this is Castillo Real Fuerza. And it was not strategic enough because it was built too far back in the harbor to be much protection, because Spain wanted to protect its harbor from Britain and eventually the United States. They wanted Cuba to only do business with Mother Spain. And of course, as Britain and then the United States abolished slavery, it was even more important to Spain to keep its ports protected and doing business only with Mother Spain. So the Castillo further in really saw its best use as the palace of the royal governor in Cuba. And beyond this, there's a building of the Generales, the actual sort of functioning magistrate building with its high arched portico, columns that you would shade people as they walked from building to building. And it's in this courtyard that you'll see the statue to Columbus. But the statue that I really want to point out to you, the statue in this fort area that I don't want you to miss, is the one to Carlos Manuel Cespedes, who in 1868 abolished slavery on his lands, and he encouraged the other landowners of Cuba to do the same. He was truly one of the first Cuban revolutionaries in that regard, and that statue honors his memory, Carlos Cespedes. Well, as we continue on into Cuba, as we continue on into the harbor of Havana, we know that we come up to dock, and the area where we come up to dock is actually the 17th into the 18th century commercial area. And this is where you'll see the Jesuit monastery, this grayish building, not very large, with this imposing doorways. It's also on this square that we see the commercial building. This was built in 1907, a beautiful turn of the century high-rise building for Havana at the time. This is when we enter the 20th century. So I'm going to take you from this plaza of the Jesuit monastery into the next main plaza. This is where we find the cathedral. The Cathedral of Havana, like the cathedral in the Spanish cities of the Old and New World, is really the heart of the city. And we stand here and reflect on this Spanish Baroque building in this absolutely stunning plaza with this massive church built much larger than the population initially demanded. So we go beyond the plaza of the cathedral and we go into the plaza Viejo. This was the central shopping district of 18th into 19th century Havana. And indeed today, the people of Havana still come to this plaza to enjoy, again, the arch porticos, a little higher, a little lighter. The buildings are not imposing stone, they're more of block. They were built of wood and then replaced with block. The plaza is open, and today it has a fanciful sculpture, and children on recess from school will play ball in the plaza. Lovely area as it was in the 18th to 19th century, it is today. As you walk down the streets, every so often in the middle of the street there's an opening, and it's surrounded by a little wrought iron fence, and you can look down into the archaeology of the early city, and it's always in mind that you are walking in a 21st century city over the streets of the early 16th century city. Long time relationship with this area of Cuba here in Havana, this major port from the time of Velázquez to today. And also as we walk through these narrow streets, there are some lovely little hotels built at the end of the 18th into the 19th century. A couple of them that I want to point out to you is Hotel Ambos Muñoz, and this was a favorite of Ernest Hemingway. Past the Hotel Ambos Muñoz is a Hotel Raquel, and this was a meeting place of the Jewish congregation of Havana. And you can go in today and still see remnants of the Jewish population where the ceremonies were held, where the services were held, sometimes of necessity in the Spanish world, in secret. So as we go through the city, we're going through this very early city, which has built up a bit. Characteristic are the balconies that we see around us. We can call it territorial, early, simple wooden balconies that in some cases were replaced by buildings of stone. All of this we see as we're walking through the old city and approaching the Prada. The Prada was the first paved boulevard of Havana. And it is the major street of the city today. It goes from the top of the city and it goes all the way down to the port. And at the top is the Capitol, looking very much like the US Capitol. Built at the end of the 19th into the 20th century, it reflected that relationship that Cuba had with the United States. And I'm saying before Batista, before the United States supported the dictator of Cuba, there was this desire to be American. In fact, there were those who wrote in Cuba that they didn't want the young to be Americanos. They wanted them to be uniquely Cuban. But the government followed the democratic precepts. And so you see this rather familiar building. If you're an American, you look at the Capitol and it's rather familiar to you. Across the street in 1926, now we see a time of more fanciful architecture, almost Art Nouveau, this ladies in the flowing garb and the softness, the fluffiness of stone architecture, castcrete architecture. It was a Belgian architect who designed the Teatro de Havana, and it opened up in 1915. Today, in contrast to this fluffy little building, this fanciful building, we see the mid-19th century cars in bright colors that are lined up in front of it, not to take people home from the theater, but to give you rides through this city. So let's continue on down the Prada, and we'll see a number of buildings, hotels and various commercial buildings where cigars are sold today. There's another open plaza of commercial buildings, a little more recent. And then you'll see a building that looks very much like a castle. And indeed, this is the Palace of the Presidents. The first use of the building was for the presidents of Cuba, and the last occupant was Fulgencio Batista, the military man who was not a Castilian Spaniard, but a mixed breed individual who was looked down upon and rose through the ranks and eventually had American support to become the president of Cuba, very much an iron-fisted dictator. And he left this building midnight 1958 during the New Year's celebration, and Castro came in with the revolution. And behind the Palace of the Presidents is a little park. And in that park, there's a rather simple building with a angled roof and glass enclosure. And in that enclosure is the Grama, the boat that Fidel Castro and his compadres used in their landing in the eastern section of Cuba as they began the Revolucion. And that is another story we'll save for another day. So as we leave the Prada and we head back, the coast now comes before us. And along the coast is the Malecón, the walkway, beautiful walkway along the water when the waves aren't so high that they're pounding over the seawall. And the people of Havana love to come out in the evening and walk along the Malecón. Before we reach the Malecón, we'll come to another historic edifice of Havana, a notable edifice of Havana. And this is the Hotel Nacional, actually built in the early 20th century. This is the place that people like to stay in today, although the bathrooms are a little bit iffy. This is the notable hotel of the city today. It was owned in its heyday in partnership between the Costa Nostra gangster Meyer Lansky and Batista. This is where the Cosa Nostra had its meetings with Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, who had been released from the U.S. prison and then offered his services to the U.S. government with intelligence during the wars. When you walk out the back of the Hotel Nacional, you're in its garden, and there's a lovely outdoor bar. And then you notice there are cannons in the garden. These cannons were there in 1898 when the USS Maine exploded in the Havana harbor and touched off the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War is a story in itself, and we will save that also for another day. But the cannons remain in place. And in this location, in the Santa Rosa Battery, where the cannons are still pointed out to the harbor, this is where those in Havana watched the events unfold in 1962, when President Kennedy dispatched the U.S. Navy in what we know as the Cuban Missile Crisis. October to November of that year was when the world held its breath. The U.S. Air Force had seen from the air, from photos taken from the air, that the Soviets had built missile silos in Cuba, not necessarily known to Castro. And the ships were dispatched. The world didn't know what was going to happen. Here you had the United States concerned about the Soviet Union building missile silos, which put Washington, D.C. within its mid-range missile. And the ships were there in a giant standoff. The U.S. and the Soviet Union negotiated quiet, and everything sort of de-escalated and came back to quiet. And Castro carried on with his revolution. But the events that occurred at this location, you could be sipping a drink at the back of the Hotel Nacional, and history, major points in history of Cuba are playing out right in front of you. One other building that you'll notice high above the rooftops is the Bacardi building, and this is where the Bacardis sold rum. It was the corporate offices of the Bacardis, and the Bacardis and rum, and Cuba to Puerto Rico, where the operations were moved to, is a story into itself. But the Bacardi building is an Art Deco masterpiece. It is a high-rise building with this fanciful cupola that is today one of the points in controversy over the embargo which President Kennedy put in place and persists today. As we walk along the Malecón past the Hotel Nacional, we walk down sort of the Plaza of Heroes. The head of the Heroes is Jose Marti, and we'll come back to him. And it ends at the U.S. Embassy. Outside the city, as we go outside Havana just a bit, we come to where there are still colonial cities. And there are people of Havana and living in the outskirts of Havana who can be lauded for their resourcefulness. And one thing they've done, among many other things, is created sort of a genre of trash art, taking objects of human existence and creating fanciful little parks of art. One of the parks that visitors love to go to is Fusterlandia. So you can pop into one of these 1950s convertibles, whether it was originally a convertible or it was adjusted to, made into a convertible, and ride out to Fusterlandia, where you see the artist had put so many mosaics around the walls of his house and the wall around his yard and his swimming pool, and he built sculptures on the roof, and the neighbors picked up the theme. So you have an entire neighborhood of colorful mosaic, also telling in part the history of Cuba and of Castro and the grandma with the other compatriots that began the revolution. Before I leave you, I should mention the Plaza de Revolucion, and this is where the government buildings are, these tall buildings, one of which has a metal sculpture on the side of Che Guevara and the other one of Fidel Castro. And this is where the government is run today. Across the way, you also see the library. And in this plaza where military marches can take place and celebrations can take place, you also have a concentration of cars waiting to take visitors on historic tours in a 1950s American automobile. But I want you to look across the plaza. There's a tall spire, one of the tallest, most noted monuments in the area of Havana. And this is to Jose Marti. Not a military man, not a politician. He was barely over 5 feet tall, but he thought deeply about human existence, about freedom and independence, And he wrote of this, and he is one of the endearing heroes of Cuba, and he's recognized in Havana with this monument. So note well Jose Marti, the heart of so many in Havana. There are so many more stories of Cuba, and so many more stories in Cruise Through History. And we can only hope that with more cultural tourism as it opens into Cuba, that there will be more of a press to resolve the embargo, to restore these historic buildings, and for Havana to rise again as this lively center of world culture as it was for so many centuries. Until I see you again on ship or in another video, be well.